Advanced TV Herstory, the podcast that brings you fresh perspective on the importance of TV in our lives. We tell stories of leadership, persistence, and achievement of TV women, because in the lives of women, no other media platform has influenced or inspired so many. Lo, these 60 years. Women of all ages have been impacted by what they've seen and will see on TV. So join us for a little advanced TV herstory by streaming it directly on our website, tvherstory.com, or anywhere you find podcasts. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.
Welcome, TV Herstorians, to another installment of Advanced TV Herstory. And you know what? Sometimes when you're looking at TV herstory, you get off the charts a little bit of TV as we know it. And we are reminded that TV is, in fact, storytelling. And storytelling is premised on the characters, the study of literature, because literature is the written word of storytelling, right? So we are fortunate today to have a professor of everything from composition to all sorts of like fun literature theory, I'm going to call it, even though I don't know the list of everything she's taught. And the reason why this is important is because anti-heroines are an emerging field or an emerging genre, I think, in TV. They are sort of akin to the anti-heroes that we've experienced in very, very popular shows. So I am thrilled today to introduce to you all listeners, Molly Brost, who is a professor at the University of Southern Indiana. And welcome, Molly.
Hi.
Molly and I connected at the Pop Culture Association conference, the annual conference, which is just this tremendous gathering of people who care about all sorts of aspects of pop culture. And a few of them actually talk about podcasting too. So it was a great time. I sat in on her session and she just started down this path of anti-heroines, and I was fascinated. And the big name that we're going to talk about and the big show is Jessica Jones. But we're also going to talk about some of the series, perhaps of the recent past and even distant past, that perhaps complement some of what Molly teaches and what she thinks about with regard to this transition to a whole new kind of character, and one that we as women need to feel more comfortable about as we see her on TV. So Molly has a background in academia. So Molly, tell us a little bit about yourself and how it is that you've come to teach what you teach. What do you teach? And how it is that you're talking about anti-heroines.
Well, my PhD is in American Culture Studies from Bowling Green State University in Ohio. And while I was there, it's an interdisciplinary program, so they try to give us background teaching a couple of different things. So while I was there, I taught intro to film and also intro to composition. And then when I finished there, I've been teaching mainly composition since then. Right now, I'm at University of Southern Indiana. I'm the assistant director of composition right now, and I teach primarily composition classes, occasionally a literature class, but mainly composition. And as far as the anti-heroine goes, when I first started way back in grad school, the first show that I looked at academically was Alias, which was a J.J. Abrams show starring Jennifer Garner that aired from 2001 to 2006. And she was an action heroine, more of a traditional heroine rather than an anti-heroine. And action heroines were very popular at the time. We had Buffy the Vampire Slayer airing from 1996 to 2003. The Lara Croft Tomb Raider film starring Angelina Jolie coming out in 2001. We had the Charlie's Angels films coming out in 2000 and 2003. So those were the first things I was interested in. And some of the academic conversations surrounding these action heroines were, for some critics, sort of complained about the fact that they were sexualized so often. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we had some critics who said that, oh, you've just sort of replaced a male main character and put a female in the lead role. Mm-hmm. And just sort of told this same type of story, only with a woman playing the lead instead of the man. But then we have some critics who are saying, well, it doesn't really work that way. You can't really just replace a male main character with a female. because women's lives tend to be different in some pretty important ways. They tend to have different expectations placed on them, and that changes the story in a little bit more fundamental ways than what you might initially think. So one of the things I'm really interested in is how traditionally male genres and roles are complicated when you put a woman in the lead role. And there has been sort of a shift away from action heroines, although you do still see some, but you have been hearing a lot more about anti-heroes and anti-heroines. And so I've been looking recently at how the anti-hero role changes when you do put a woman in that role.
Okay, for the purposes of the listeners and myself included, who had never, gosh, where was I? I can tell you where I was in the 90s. Actually, I was raising kids and hardly watching much TV. But what would you say is the definition of an action heroine? As you've just given us some lists, what's the action part?
Well, the action heroine, like, for example, Sydney Bristow in Alias, she was a spy. She worked for the CIA. So she was often engaged in physical altercations. The same type of thing with some of these other characters. Even if they weren't spies, they typically had very physical roles.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were physically fighting adversaries. So that would be the action heroine part of it, whether they be like, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, actually a vampire slayer, or a spy, or just something that required them to be very physical in these roles.
And so I guess when we think of a relatively recent term in the last 10 years or so, the notion of agency, of a woman having agency, maybe we needed to break through to deliver that agency by having so many different examples in a relatively brief period of time of women being active again. Because before that, you sort of had like the Bionic Woman and Wonder Woman, and that was, there wasn't much more. And I guess the original Charlie's Angels was a little campy and action, but all through SVU and the shows of so many other shows, they don't really tackle, it's not overt. I don't know. It's just not overt action. But when you combine action with sort of the heroine aspect, then you really get to the point of agency, of self-control, of universal control of her life and her position. And it was a breakthrough. I don't know. This is just kind of interesting. So Molly, I'm kind of fascinated by how it is that you are such a strong writer. You teach communication, you teach people how to write, and yet you also have this affinity and interest for TV and depiction of women on TV. Where does that come from your teenage and young adult years?
Well, I would say in my teenage years, I was more interested in like teen dramas like Dawson's Creek, 90210, all of those types of shows, Felicity, these different shows that were popular when I was a teen and in college and things like that. And Felicity was actually a J.J. Abrams show as well. And then Alias was his next show. So I kind of followed him as a fan and kind of went from there.
Okay. Well, we're grateful then that your interest it documents the evolution of the depiction of young women to go from 90210 and Dawson's Creek had a lot to do with relationships, and it had an ensemble casts, and it was traditional storytelling. And now you've kind of reminded us that there were these action heroines as well. And now we're about to talk about the anti-heroine. And so help us understand whether or not we've seen other anti-heroines and where that gets us to with regard to Jessica Jones and your belief of where she's taking us.
Well, the show that initially interested me in looking at anti-heroines was I was looking at Scandal, starring Kerry Washington. And when I was reading some of the popular articles about her, I heard her referred to as an anti-heroine a lot. And she did eventually become a very dark character as the show progressed. But at the time she was being described as this initially, I sort of questioned whether she was an anti-heroine or whether she should just be considered a heroine. And also the term in these articles was being applied to a lot of female characters that were very different from each other. Some examples, Claire Underwood from House of Cards, Skylar White from Breaking Bad, even Meredith Grey from Grey's Anatomy. And so I wanted to look a little bit
deeper into the term and think about what causes a woman to be labeled as an anti-heroine, as opposed to just maybe a complex female character or just a straight up heroine. So what are some of these characteristics that get someone labeled as an anti-heroine?
I find that very fascinating. And so, listeners, Molly is developing the framework of a book, and it's fascinating, and it gets into these layers of complexities and these series of characters that have now been defined as anti-heroines or complex characters, and they do have some very similar traits. When we talk about what these traits or qualities are, and you've mentioned, Scandal, and you've mentioned Grey's Anatomy. So we know these shows, we know these women. What are specifically some of these traits, and which ones do you think are outlier traits, and which ones are kind of the key components if you had to write a fresh definition of an anti-heroine?
Well, a lot of the women that get defined as anti-heroines, one, first off, they don't always behave in like morally upright ways. So looking at Olivia Pope on Scandal, even from the beginning, she was having an off-again, on-again affair with the President of the United States. With Jessica Jones, she drinks fairly heavily, so not always what we would look at as, heroic or typically morally upright. A lot of these women have been through some sort of trauma or have some sort of troubled past or family issues. And even though Alias wasn't one that was looked at as her being an anti-heroine, she was more just a straight-up heroine. She had some of these past issues as well. Some of these women we see dealing with mental health issues. Carrie from Homeland would be one of those. Or one thing that's interesting is sometimes even if they are not overtly described as having mental health issues, a lot of times critics or viewers or even other characters on the show will try to diagnose them, diagnose their behavior as being attributed to some sort of underlying issue. Mm-hmm. Another thing that comes up sometimes is that sometimes these women are described as unlikable. Roxane Gay has said that sometimes a woman character that if she was a man who would be labeled an anti-hero, with a woman, viewers just say she's unlikable and say that, she may even be unrealistic because of that unlikability. So she argues that sometimes women are actually denied this anti-hero label just because they're not perceived as likable.
That's a fascinating point. If you expand it out and you start thinking about all of the characters who have been dismissed through the years, and in fact, some series probably rendered to the dust pile prematurely. It's because the woman just, she doesn't smile enough and all of that. And really, in fact, it's a complex character in the making, where if she'd just been given another season, we would have been treated to some fabulous storytelling. And the writers who are coming up with this, I mean, they're the best that we have coming out of screenwriting programs and undergrad degrees and graduate degrees. This is beyond Green Acres. And I think Americans can really, any viewer of any ethnicity or any country that's watching this, we are known for being able to deliver a really quality scripted TV show that pushes the boundaries of the human experience, not the American experience, the human experience. So why wouldn't women, who are 52% of the population, give or take, why wouldn't they have the same sort of complexity and nuance and troubles that we find out of some of the most prominent characters? So that, listeners, is just my representation 101 rant of the episode. We're going to get back to Molly, who has given this much more specific thought and is developing just a lot of examples to go into her book. So these are traits. We know them as somewhat unlikable, as sometimes unethical. They may or may not be experiencing mental illness or other sorts of health challenges. How then are these women different from what we see in male anti-heroes? And maybe you've already answered that, but I feel like you probably have something in your gut that just needs to be unleashed with regard to how it is that we hold these standards different.
Well, the interesting thing is a lot of the male characters who've been labeled as anti-heroes are straight up criminals. So, Walter White on Breaking Bad's a big one, who is, of course, like a meth kingpin. Tony Soprano on The Sopranos, Dexter Morgan on Dexter, who was actually a serial killer. Whereas, you do see some female characters engaging in some sort of criminal activity. One name that comes up a lot is Nancy Botwin, Mary Louise Parker's character on Weeds. But a lot of the characters that I've listed previously aren't necessarily criminals. They're just women who, sometimes, quote unquote, behave badly.
Mm-hmm. Let's just talk a little bit then about Jessica Jones, because your presentation at the Pop Culture Association was in depth about Jessica Jones. And whether or not a listener has watched this series or not, Jessica Jones is played by Krysten Ritter and presents with a bit of a backstory. And then she has these superpowers. But don't, listeners, if you haven't watched it, and we're trying to encourage you to do so because it is really fascinating, innovative programming. Molly, help us understand where the superpowers fit in and that it's all part of a larger package and some bigger thinking.
Yeah, so Jessica Jones as a character basically got superpowers in an accident. And so she has had these since she was fairly young. And a couple of the things that come up with her, first off, some questions that are raised on the show itself is whether she is a hero. In the second season of the show, you have other characters like directly commenting that, for example, her adopted sister Trish might make a better hero than her because she's more like conventionally attractive, more conventionally what we would think of as good. There's also the issue that she has these super powers, but she, for quite some time, hasn't really gone out of her way to be heroic. But she is capable of doing these big things, and people sometimes call upon her to do these big things. So that's another question that comes up. Also, she's dealing with some trauma. I'm not sure how much backstory would you like me to get into?
I think just sort of set the scene because it is important. We're not foisting something that's animated, this side of Powerpuff Girls on you listeners, but in fact it is somewhat serious. Just do what might be necessary so that somebody who might be triggered would know.
So the first season of the show, there have been 2 seasons so far, it mainly focuses on a villain named Kilgrave, who's played by David Tennant, and he has mind control powers. So if he tells someone to do something, they automatically do it, whether it's something they would normally want to do or not. Like, for example, in the first season, at one point, we see a support group for victims of Kilgrave. And one person tells a story how Kilgrave got him to let him into his car. His baby in the backseat was crying. Kilgrave told him to put the baby out on the street. He did. And of course, this caused, Child Protective Services to be called. His wife eventually divorced him. It had really thrown his life into shambles. And he was horrified that he had done this, but he had no choice. And Jessica Jones herself has been a victim of Kilgrave. And so that raises a lot of issues because it's like, well, she has superpowers, though. She couldn't resist him. And she herself is dealing with the trauma of the things that she has done while under his control. And so we see like a lot of parallels to domestic violence and abusive relationships. And also with Jessica Jones, since it is a series and not just a movie, we get to see the after effects of that and how she deals with it and how it's not just something, oh, I'm free now, I'm over this. It is something that she continually has to deal with.
Mm. So it feels to me like this is, it's fiction. It's fiction, no different than if we had a series of books and a favorite character, and she was doing exactly this, only we were reading it instead of watching it. My question, though, regards to some degree this evolution of really understanding a woman character who has greater agency over her situation and is not just using a cookie cutter approach to problem solving and achieving goals and reining in justice. So the idea that she has superpowers, to me, at my age, I'm sort of like, really? Does she have to have superpowers? And yet, is that the spoonful of medicine that helps us sort of break through and really get to understand that there are women out there doing remarkable things and they aren't necessarily pleasant and they don't smile when they're doing it. You know what I mean?
I think that's part of it. I also think just the idea that, I mean, she is a victim of abuse and trauma. Just the fact that she does have these superpowers, I think it illustrates to us that this can happen to anyone. Even the best and strongest among us can be victims of abuse and have to overcome this trauma once they're out of the situation. So it's one thing to have sort of an ordinary woman who this happens to, but with her actually having these superpowers, it opens up another realm of, again, even the best and strongest among us are not necessarily safe from this.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. And it is empowering then, even to the average viewer who watches it and sees a little bit of herself in Jessica Jones, just as I'm finishing up a Daria episode, actually it publishes this week. And when you think about what Daria has said and what she represented, we can see ourselves in these fictional characters, and maybe it causes us a little bit more reflection. And when the time comes, does it in fact inspire us to be better than before we ever knew that this character existed? So a little bit more then about Jessica Jones, and you've talked about some of the experiences that she has with Kilgrave, the situations that she's encountered. Describe some of these issues, the real, the sort of at the heart of some of these relationships that she has and these, what she gets herself into.
Well, basically, another big thing that happens in the first season is that victims of Kilgrave start reaching out to her for help. And she initially is very resistant to this idea of helping them because she's scared. I mean, she's scared of Kilgrave and what she's done while she was under his control. So she has to push past this fear and come forward because she's really the only one who can help these people. So that's one of the big things so it's sort of the question, is she an anti-heroine? Is she more a reluctant heroine that even though she may want to sort of just back away from this life and just try to go on about her day to day, the fact that she does have these powers sort of gives her, a responsibility or an ability to help people that the other victims of Kilgrave might not have.
Mm-hmm. And are there social issues that get woven into this? I feel like there's a heroin addict. Is that right?
Yes, there is. And that's another thing that this person, he was a victim of Kilgrave as well. And he actually became addicted to drugs because of things that Kilgrave forced him to do. So we see that woven in as well. Again, as I mentioned, just people who've done any number of terrible things to themselves, to their own children, to their bodies, all of these things, and having to deal with, even though, it's mind control. So it was all just things he told them to do. It's not like he was forcing them at gunpoint in most cases. So it's a question, it raises a lot of questions of how much free will do we have? How much is it your fault when you're being coerced to do these things by someone else?
And with any luck, audiences or viewers take that conversation back and they end up having, philosophical conversations with other viewers or with people in their lives who are all trying to sort of better understand humanity in 2018, because it just feels like everything has gotten more complicated. And we learn from TV, I think. We don't necessarily learn how to handle something, but by watching Jessica Jones or series like hers, we have more exposure to things that otherwise we wouldn't necessarily encounter.
Right. And I think that's part of why the anti-heroine genre or, anti-heroes as a whole, why that's kind of emerged, is that we don't necessarily want to see people behaving perfectly all the time. We want people, even if they're in these crazy circumstances, like, with superpowers, all these things, we want to see them dealing with somewhat relatable things and dealing with problems as opposed to life just going on perfectly all the time.
And in 2018, when you talk about this, when you present at conferences and things, do you find that women are ready for this message and sort of fascinated by what they are now seeing on TV?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and just a lot of the talk, even just like the popular articles about the anti-heroine, even if, I might have disagreements about which women qualify as anti-heroines, which one don't, what's pretty clear is that women are pretty eager to see other women who maybe don't always act perfectly all the time, who maybe do have some flaws and are allowed to behave badly at times. So that's one thing that I think is really appealing to people about this genre.
And as you do your research for your book, and I realize some of that is to take the examples in series that have already aired and maybe are now no longer presenting fresh episodes, do you get a sense that there are other anti-heroine series in the works? Have you been able to figure that out from Twitter or any of the reading you're doing?
Well, one thing that I'm doing with this book is there are some shows that I'm looking at in different genres that you wouldn't necessarily even think of as having a hero or an anti-heroine or anything like that, and showing how they've sort of been affected by this, how even though they might not fit this mold, they're allowed to have some of these more complex behaviors, and they're interrogating some of these issues, like some you wouldn't think of, like comedies like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend on the CW, You're the Worst on FX. So some of these things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as fitting into these genres, but we do see these very complex heroines who are dealing with some of these same issues. And even though they might not necessarily even be inspired by the anti-heroine, maybe the anti-heroine has allowed us to explore more of these issues, or allowed women in series on a variety of genres to show a little bit more depth and to interrogate some of these issues.
Yes, and since we are sort of seeking a new definition of, or rightly claiming ground of a new definition of what a woman anti-heroine character can and should be, that it doesn't necessarily have to align in a misrepresented way to a male definition. Yes, it makes total sense that you're out wandering in other fields and other genres to see where else those traits pop up and how it is that those characters factor into other story arcs and, treasured storytelling. So I guess when you think about the series of the last couple of years, the series that have been developed and aimed at younger women, Gen X, millennial women, is Jessica Jones different in any way? Do you think that they've taken some risk putting her out there? I mean, she wears gray most of the time. What are some of the things that they've done to just separate her from anything else we've seen? Because I definitely feel like you're signing up for something when you watch this series.
I would agree with that. And I would say, as a whole, television has been getting a lot darker, I would say, within the past decade. We talked a little bit about teen shows, for example, and I got into a conversation recently about the series Veronica Mars, and I said at the time it seemed really dark for a teen show, but now teen shows are darker yes. as a whole. Like if you look at like Riverdale or Gossip Girl or anything like that. But so, where it's not necessarily, I guess, edgy or different for Jessica Jones to go to a darker place, I think the thing that's really unique about it is it combines so many different elements, because we do have, bringing in elements of the superhero genre and elements of the private eye genre, which typically often is a male character, the anti-heroine narrative, the trauma issues that she's dealing with. So, I mean, it's really pretty heavy and also I think pretty clever, I think, all of the different elements that it's tying in, how they're able to do that. And I think with it being, even though it's in the Marvel universe, with it being a television series rather than a film, we're able to get a little bit deeper into the character and tell more of a ongoing story.
Mm-hmm. For listeners who have gotten this far in, because they really are, they're maybe students of literature or students of writing theory or character development. Jessica Jones is not on the traditional broadcast channels, right? It's not on ABC, NBC, or CBS. How can somebody watch Jessica Jones these days?
Jessica Jones is on Netflix. So I think that's also another important thing, because as you mentioned, with these network shows, they do have certain rules that they're supposed to adhere to. I think probably a certain number of viewers they're expected to hit. But with being on Netflix, I think that gives them a little bit more room to do some different things as well.
Yes, and probably was the risk that somebody took, even launching it in the first place. Perhaps setting a new standard for dark as it's aimed at young women, but also aimed at an audience base that naturally now is expecting quality programming from Netflix, where they can get darker, the language can be saltier, and it's an adult place because you can restrict it as such.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it premiered in 2015, which makes it heading into its third season.
Yes. Fairly recently, they announced it had been renewed for a third season. Yes.
Excellent. Well, so listeners, we have given you an opportunity to think about a summer binge, although maybe in small doses, depending upon where you are in your life. But if you're looking for that fascinating, complex, multi-layered character, Jessica Jones, as depicted by Krysten Ritter, it will go down as I think as a significant series. It's a game changer, as was Veronica Mars, as was Buffy. Molly, when you're teaching this, do you find yourself kind of saying that this show is seminal, this series?
I haven't really had a chance to teach this a lot. I've given presentations on it and things like that. But yes, I would agree that it is fairly foundational as a series.
Cool. So we've just explored, or I mentioned briefly, that you are putting together the framework and starting to really develop a book. What are some of the other projects on your desk? And what are you teaching this summer?
I'm teaching advanced composition this summer. The book is taking most of my attention right now as far as projects go. So trying to get that all worked out and out there.
And will this then be your first book?
Yes.
Cool. Well, we wish you all the best luck in developing the right span of topics, and that as you look to interview people, we wish you the best, that all of the pieces come together so that you can help us better understand the importance of the anti-heroine in TV herstory and how it will continue to unfold to create new characters and new levels of quality programming that feature women as lead characters. Is there a way that listeners can further contact you to either ask questions or provide some feedback about their impressions of some of these characters we've mentioned?
Sure. They can either contact me at my university email address, which is mjbrost@usi.edu, or my personal email is fine as well, and that's molly_brost@yahoo.com.
All right. Excellent. Well, Molly, it has been so much fun going down a very deep hole of character stuff. I mean, every time I end up having a professor on as a guest, we get to some of those fundamental questions that, yes, you had an English class in 7th grade and you maybe encountered again in college, but it all is a reminder that this is storytelling. It's storytelling at its finest. And we are experiencing some really high quality work on TV, but we only get to appreciate it because someone like you, who has really mastered the theoretical side, can explain it to us and open our eyes a little wider. So thank you so much for preparing and being a part of this interview today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And any other closing thoughts about where you think TV is going, or Netflix, or anything you want listeners to know?
I just think we're in a really interesting time for TV now, with just there being so many different avenues for us to see it. I mean, the regular networks, things like HBO and Showtime, and with these streaming services like Hulu and Netflix, I think it is a really great time where we're seeing a lot of variety on TV and have a lot of opportunities to see a lot of different types of characters.
Which I guess, as a conclusion, is all the more reason why anybody who is taking your writing class perhaps begins to realize how important writing is to storytelling and what a fertile field it is out there. So right. What a great way to end this conversation. Listeners, it has been a great pleasure to present Molly Brost to you and this discussion of Jessica Jones, which is a Netflix product. if the time is right, check it out and watch a couple episodes and see what you think. If you like it, or if you've been a long-time fan of Jessica Jones, shoot me an email at advancedtvherstory@gmail.com and let me know your thoughts. Maybe we have prompted a few observations that you want to share, and we will integrate it into a future show. You can follow us on Twitter at TV Herstory, and we have a Facebook page, Advanced TV Herstory, a podcast. This episode, as always, is edited by Jen Eads of brassybroadcast.com. And we have a Patreon page. So if you think that this is quality discussion that you want to see continue, do head to our Patreon page, Advanced TV Herstory, off of patreon.com. Also, if you go to tvherstory.com, which is our regular website, on the homepage, scroll down, you will see a little button that says Become a Patron. And we would be honored if you did. We have a patron now. Rochelle Minsloff is our first patron. So we have a supporter, and we are so grateful. Otherwise, just send us notes and thoughts and comments and feedback and ideas for future installments. And if you have a professor or a teacher in your life who has made a difference and taught by using examples from TV, which that's exactly what we've done. You just took a little mini class thanks to Doctor, you are a PhD, right? Dr. Brost? So here I've been just calling her a professor all this time. Well, thank you very much, Molly. Thank you, listeners. This is Why I Podcast. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.